Today we continue our NHL offseason plan series. We're now on the 13th ranked team from the 21-22 season, the Washington Capitals. What should we expect from the Capitals this offseason? Who do they have on expiring contracts? What's their cap situation like? We'll discuss what to expect coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we're now looking at the Washington Capitals, the 13th ranked team from the NHL's 21-22 regular season standings. So, of course, if you're not familiar or new to this series, what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick recap of 21-22, take a quick look at how things went, explore their salary cap space that they have going into next year. We're going to analyze their expiring contracts and decide what their top priorities are, or what are the top burning questions facing the franchise as we head into the full scale of the offseason here. So now let's get started and recap the 21-22 Washington Capitals season. So we know they had a good year. They made the playoffs. They were a 100-point team, finishing with a record of 44, 26, and 12. They grabbed fourth place in the Metropolitan Division. Kind of crazy to see the fourth place team end up being a wildcard team with 100 points. That's not something that normally happens here. Usually you see some teams in the 90s, like 92, 94, 96 in that range, but all teams in the Eastern Conference cracked 100 points or better this year. Kind of crazy to think about. The Washington Capitals scored 270 goals for 10th best in the NHL. They've for a long time been one of the NHL's more offensive groups. The goals against were pretty decent as well. 242 goals against for 13th best. But surprisingly, with all that offense, including Alex Ovechkin, who really rarely misses time, only had an 18.8% success rate on the power play for 13th best in the league. That's certainly not up to their standards and a little bit surprising to see, but probably the real only blip that's in most offensive categories at least. On the PK, they were very respectable, 80.4%. for 12th best overall. So, of course, going into the playoffs, they had to basically cross over to the Atlantic Division due to the wild card spot that they were able to obtain, getting the second one, and they did battle with the President's Trophy winning Florida Panthers, who they lost to 4-2, a best of 7 series. So certainly they put up a good fight, though, and at times it looked like they might be able to move past the Panthers. There's certainly some close games there, and like I said, I know by the time we were at games 2, 3, 4, like I thought it could go either way, and thought the Capitals just might pull it off. So of course, now let's jump over and take a look at their salary cap space that they're looking at going into this offseason. Now, going into the 22-23 season, the Capitals actually have 18 NHL contracts already on the book. So that's a big number compared to a lot of the teams we've already looked at in this series. We've seen teams with 13, 14, maybe 16, but 18 is a lot. So that ties up $73.5 million in used cap space for Washington, which means they have $8.978 million available. That's not really a whole heck of a lot, but they do have a couple of big question marks, though, on some of these deals that we're going to talk about here in just a couple of moments. But first up, with that salary cap space, we need to look at what expiring contracts do they have. They have 18 contracts on the books, but who needs to either be re-signed or replaced going into next year? Well, first up, let's look at their restricted list of free agents here, and it's their 2 goaltenders. You got Vitek Vanacek and Ilya Samsonov. So certainly, I think there's some debate on what their goaltending tandem is going to look like next year. I don't think these guys did a poor job by any means, but it does appear to be on the wish list here to maybe go in with something different next year. I do suspect both will be qualified, and both are going to get a contract and play in the NHL next year, but I wonder if they'll both be Capitals. We'll see and talk about that further in the next segment. On their list of unrestricted free agents, we have Marcus Johansson, who was reacquired at the deadline. It's doubtful he returns. You never know, but not likely. Johan Larsson was another trade deadline acquisition for some extra depth. Unlikely he returns. You have the defenseman Justin Schultz, Matt Irwin, and Michael Kempny. Now, that's all debatable on those fronts. I'm not sure if any or all can return. Like I said, they have a tight amount of money. They need a goaltender. There's not going to be a lot to go around. It's debatable on what they do. I think we could see a little bit of a different looking blue line for the Caps next year. Hard to say. And Phoenix Copley as well, who's obviously at times has been an NHL goaltender, but for the most part has been more of a minor league third string goaltender, is also UFA this year. debatable what happens with him. I would think there's probably a possibility he might look for more opportunity elsewhere or see what he has in store for himself. Now, with all that being reviewed, let's take a look at the top priorities, or what are the top burning questions facing the Capitals going into this offseason. For me, the biggest question is the health of top center iceman Nicklas Backstrom. After the Capitals season ended and they did their end of season media availability, Backstrom revealed that he's still having some issues with the hip. Obviously, he had a pretty extensive surgery last year, missed a lot of time this year, but was able to come back and play. But it's far from 100%. He says it may never be 100%, and it's going to be, evaluating things with doctors this offseason. Couldn't really rule out exactly what happens. There's talk of rehab, possibly another surgery. Sounded like he was going to be getting multiple opinions and kind of determining what is next. And even though he didn't come out and say it, there are some that do have concerns whether or not he can even play. So whether or not Backstrom can play is a big question mark. They could end up with a possibility that even if let's say he has another surgery, it could be a big recovery, and he could miss significant time again next year. So it's really debatable, and it's quite likely. I mean, it's hard to kind of determine what the odds are here. But I would not rule out the chance that Backstrom has to at least start the season on long-term injury reserve. I mean, that is a possibility. And then maybe have something similar to this year where he comes back later in the season if everything goes well. But we don't know that yet, right? There is some big question marks, and he's a big part of this team. Obviously, for the bulk of his career, number one center, there's been times when Kuznetsov would kind of trade up places. But for the most part, he's been playing a lot with Ovechkin again, and he's a huge part there. So his health and whether or not he can play, also a pretty big deal. Now we also know another big question mark here, which we kind of have more details on what to expect, is the health of Tom Wilson, another top six forward for the Capitals. Wilson suffered a pretty significant injury in round one of the Stanley Cup Playoffs this year. We didn't really hear a lot about it during the series with the Panthers, just that he was, from one game to the next, they said he wasn't available. And at one point, I think we heard he was unlikely to come back, but they never really said much, which is not unusual. That's usually how things go. But then we found out that he had a torn ACL, required some major knee surgery, and is going to be out 6 to 8 months recovering, which means he's not going to be available for training camp. He's not going to be available for the start of next season. So again, another contract that's a decent value here, and another top six forward that might not be available on day one of the 22-23 regular season, and could bump up their amount that they're into long-term injury reserve should they choose to use that as a tool to spend above the cap, which is a possibility here. I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, I know that's all we know right now for their players that are at least significantly injured. I mean, TJ Oshie's another guy who's been banged up a lot over the years, and in and out, and Mantha's missed time. Ovi's stayed relatively healthy, but this is a team that has some serious question marks over the health of its players, and it could be a big issue going into next year. So to me, you can't just replace those guys. For one, I mean, Tom Wilson is a pretty unique player. Nicklas Backstrom is one of the more creative, better passing centers of his generation. You can't just up and replace him. Even if they go on long-term injury reserve, sure, you can replace them temporarily, but then what happens when they're ready to come back? Unless they're going to be out for the entire season, you don't really have that option, and we don't know that yet. I mean, for Wilson, we know he should be able to return. It's a little bit more certain of what he's looking at, whereas Backstrom is more question mark. So we'll see, but certainly, some big problems there that they have to really think about and see what happens. Now, another top priority for this team, which we heard directly from GM Brian McClellan, so this should not be a surprise. This is not only my opinion, but it's more his, is that he wants to change the goaltending up and acquire a veteran goaltender. Now, he didn't make mention if it'd be free agency or trade. Probably going to explore both options, but I would not expect Vitek Vanacek and Ilya Samsonov to be the Capitals duo next year. Now, I mean, I guess it's remotely possible if they don't find a free agent goalie or a trade that makes sense for them. I think long term, I think they probably still want to bet more on Samsonov, but Vanacek has been pretty good himself, so it's difficult to say, but they could use one of those goalies as a trade to acquire something else that they're going to need here. Like I said, I have concerns on their blue line next year. They have a bunch of UFAs, and I think they're going to probably have to bring in some different players. And I do wonder what the blue line holds. The question mark in goal. Now, what they get for a veteran goaltender, I don't know. But, I mean, theoretically, if they can get a decent veteran goalie and they have one of the guys they have now, I think their goaltending could be okay. Obviously having Alex Ovechkin out there, I think for the most part, he's still a fairly dominant player. Gives you a chance to win. You still have guys like Kuznetsov and Oshie. You got Anthony Mantha, who's he's a former 25-30 goal guy. If he can get back to his form and stay healthy, that would be big for this team. You do have a few up-and-coming players that can hopefully take some steps next year, gain a bigger role, like a Connor McMichael, for example. Can he increase things and play a bigger offensive role for them next year? You have to think about that too, right? So, this team certainly has its fair share of aging veterans that have been banged up a lot and are facing a lot of uncertainty over their health. I mean, Tom Wilson's not as old as some of them by any means, but there's a lot of question marks. And on the blue line, like I said, with those 3 UFA defensemen, I don't know if there's much of an appetite to bring back any of them. And if there is, it's going to be tough to do because you still have John Carlson, Dmitry Orlov, Nick Jensen, and Trevor Van Riemsdyk under contract. Could they move somebody? I guess it's possible. But they're all over 30 years of age. And to me, they need to find a way to get younger. And these guys that are UFA defensemen, they're all kind of in the same boat. The Capitals have an older group, and they need to be able to find a way, in my opinion, to mix in some more youth. And this has been a team that's been high in the standings, having a lot of success for a long time, which also typically leaves you a little bit short on the prospect pool. They haven't always been a team to kind of trade away their picks. But still, when you keep your picks, when you're a team like them that's, making the playoffs every year and winning a round or two, and, in case of a few years back, winning the cup, your picks are typically a little bit later, and you're not getting as much of a chance to grab, a higher-end talented player, which means you need even better scouts and drafting team put together to kind of snag your diamonds in the rough a little bit later on. And, they do have some players that are coming up, but they don't have a lot of them. So I do have concerns that as much as Ovechkin wants to probably keep trucking here, I know he probably wants to chase down Wayne Gretzky's record. He'd probably love to win another Stanley Cup, but it's starting to become a little bit more foreseeable that this team is slowly taking steps back. And the big thing for me, though, is they need to find a way to get younger. So if I'm hearing the GM say, I want to get a veteran goaltender, I understand where he's coming from, but it does concern me a little bit that they may not see the need to try to get younger because there's just so many players that the older you get, the more wear and tear on your body, and just the more likely you're going to run into injury issues. And we'll see if they don't start the season with Backstrom and Wilson, and they could be in big trouble. It's hard to say, right? A lot of the other guys, if they pick up their game, they can probably still remain competitive, but they're in an ultra tough division here. I mean, look at the teams that were ahead of them this year, and then you had the Islanders with an off season. That if the Islanders can bounce back, and then you get the Rangers and you get the Canes. Hard to say what happens with Pittsburgh. They have a lot of question marks around them as well. We'll see if Philly can get better. They obviously had an abysmal year, so it's going to be tough in Washington. I have no doubt. But to me, I think they need to find answers to their own internal health questions first and foremost. Probably make a change in goal. Maybe add, if they can, at least a younger defenseman. Try to add a little bit of youth on the back end, and at the same time, maybe find some ways to have some depth pieces be able to step up and take on some bigger roles here, while guys like Wilson and possibly Backstrom are out to start the year. So let me know what you expect from the Washington Capitals down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. And of course, stay tuned for the rest of this series as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.